I'm tier ranking everything I read in the second quarter of the year. Starting with A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. This was one of my favorite reads of the year. I love vampires. I love this unique epistolary style of telling a story, and the prose themselves are so melodic and beautiful. And then on top of that, I loved S.T. Gibson's attention to detail with vampiric lore. She totally made up her own rules for how these vampires would work and survive. Engaging, interesting, and she would just throw these little tidbits here and there about how people were losing their humanity or how they were transforming into vampires over time. Found that very slow, ongoing transformation to be way more engaging than like you wake up the next night and you're a vampire kid. This was sitting as my favorite read of the year for quite a while. I've read something new recently that's unthroned it, but it's still definitely going, and read this now. Next is going to be After Dark by Minka Kent. This is a book that I only got 3 or 4 chapters in before putting it down. It just wasn't gripping me, and since this is a thriller, I felt like it was failing at its core purpose. I do acknowledge this is a me issue and that other readers' experience may vary, but I think this is probably going to be an easy don't like. Next is going to be Blood Mountain by Eliza Lynn Valdez. As a sequel to Hollow Beast, this was a highly anticipated read for me. I could not wait for this to come out. That said, it did take me a while to get through this one because it just wasn't connecting with me on the same level that its first book was. It's not bad. I still like the vibes and the aesthetic. I'm still pretty invested in Jodie and her family. I'm definitely going to be reading the third one when it comes out, but this one in and of itself I think is just going to be an easy doesn't live up to series quality. Next is Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. This was fine. It was a reread for me. I think it's a solid story. I understand why it's a gothic staple. At this time in my reading, in the context of Poe's larger works and in the context of gothic literature, and even in like the subgenre of haunted houses, creepy houses kind of stories, I think this one is just like generic but fine. Next is going to be Forgotten Sisters by Cynthia Pelayo. This is a modern gothic horror novel set in Chicago with a lot of historic information about Chicago woven into the narrative, and it's also got the wonderful heart of Anderson's The Little Mermaid woven in as well. So there's like these mermaid comparisons, there's old Chicago versus new Chicago, restless spirits kind of stuff going on. And in present day, there's these unsolved murders happening by the lake, and interesting enough, it's men who are going missing instead of women, and we think we might have a serial killer on the loose. There's a radio podcast element, there's this isolation, there's like this sisterly relationship and recovering from tragedy. There's just so many elements woven together in like this very unique writing style that transforms the further into the story you get. Like, it starts out more modern, and we do switch perspectives between the sisters and the detectives are always a lot straighter, more honest, crime procedurally terse. Where the sisters like always have a little bit more flowy, poetic sense, but it becomes more imaginative and more like old-timey language the further in you go. And there's a reason for it. So it all ties together and is telling a very unique story. I can tell that Cynthia Pelayo has done a ton of research and groundwork to give us this story. She has a really unique, fascinating voice that I'm looking for more from. It's twisty, turny, moody, gothic, thriller, crime, all wrapped together in one. And I loved it. All of that said, I do think the ending is probably its weakest element. You're either gonna love or hate it. And I think all of the different things did weave together and were necessary to tell this kind of story in the way that Pelayo was telling it. But I would 100% understand if people got to the end of this and were like, ugh. Or if people were reading this and they felt like it wasn't moving quickly enough and put it down. So I'm gonna put this in I had a good time because I understand why it's not for everyone. Next is going to be Haven by Claire Kent. I've spoken about this book a couple of times. Also, Heather over at Hia Booktubes praises this book all the time. Is it worth the hype? If you're into romance, if you're into like an apocalyptic dystopian world, hell yes. This is definitely worth the hype. It is so good. I love that like going back to the earth, working on a farm, trying to survive the raiders kind of fiction. I think both of the characters who are like leading this farm together are excellent excellently balanced and a really good match for each other. They're complex characters, they're their own beings making their own decisions. It's not a stand-in for the reader. They have a great slow burn romance that makes everything feel really well earned. And I do think this is like a twist of Claire Kent's usual stuff because she does like this strong, silent, He-Man alpha kind of guy. And even though the male protagonist in this still is doing that to a little bit, the female character here who's supposed to fall in love with him is also strong, silent, suppressing her emotions, withholding things, and like easily withdrawing from certain stuff. So the two of them together, both refusing to talk about their feelings and emotions and both being a little unsure about where they stand with the other, feels more even-footed. I loved this world. I love this idea. It's a whole series by Claire Kent, and you can bet that I plan to read them all. This is an easy read this now for me. Even if you're not a big romance reader, if you're into like a dystopian world, I think there's enough world building, there's enough interesting things going on. Next is going to be If You See Her by Ania Ailborn. This is the second book I've read by this author, with the first one being The Shuddering last year. I see a lot of similarities between this and The Shuddering, like both open up with like a gruesome element and then we flash into the main characters as they were. I think it works a lot better here than it did in The Shuddering because If You See Her, we open up with our three main leads as children going into the house, the traumatic incident happening, one of their friends dying, and then we flash into their adult lives. So there's like a repetition, a sicklier element there that works really well. Also, they don't show the death on page. This is more gothic, sorrowful, ennui kind of story where The Shuddering was more of like a gore slasher. I find it interesting that between the two works, Ania Ailborn still hasn't really 100% nailed down that likable character. I'm wondering if a signature of her horror is just that the characters aren't completely relatable and they're all kind of bad people, so you don't have to feel super bad that bad things are happening to them. You're still rooting for them. The supernatural thing going on in this book is horrible enough, compounded with the fact that our character has suffered trauma and they have a couple of core redeeming elements, even though as a whole I think they're bad people, that I was like, okay, I am rooting for him and I am worried for him and his family. The book is too long. It is too repetitive. There were several elements we could have cut. Ania Ailborn does tie those random things back into the plot overall to make it like worth it or relevant, but it's done in a way that I think is a little bit clumsy. And like personally, if I had been her rereading my work, I'd have been like, this isn't really working. This is already pretty long. Let's just cut it instead of trying to like ham-fist it into the story. All of that said, I think I'm gonna drop it into I Had a Good Time. Next is gonna be Into Their Woods by Anne Denton and Ivy Asher. You know what, it took me a minute to remember this plot, so I'm just gonna put it into don't remember. It's a disappointing read, but it doesn't fall quite into don't like it. I won't be following up in this series. I have been planning to do like a deep dive on Ivy Asher based off of me reading Rabid in the early part of this year, but based off of Into Their Woods, I'm thinking maybe not. And the same thing for Anne Denton. I wanted to read more from her because I've read a lot of Katie May Anne Denton books and liked them, but this one combined with Ravaging for Monsters I think has turned me off from reading any Anne Denton standalones as well. Next is going to be Stillman Creek by Rachel Kane. This is the sequel to Stillhouse Lake. I think it doesn't live up to series quality. I'll talk about Stillhouse Lake when we get to it in the list, but Stillman Creek had a lot of potential in it, following a mother and her two children who are in hiding because her husband, unbeknownst to her, was a serial killer. They put him away in jail, but unfortunately like the mob of angry internet people and victims wanting revenge just is ongoing. So she's been like hiding their identity and stuff to keep them safe. All of that catches up to them in book one, and we close out book one with her husband escaping jail. So obviously here in book two, the stakes are really high because the husband is coming after her and her children. We're pretty sure he's gonna kill her. We're not 100% certain what the consequences for her children will be if he gets his hands on them. And I did like that ambiguous element because she was living with him, with her children for years in a quote unquote happy marriage. And she does talk about like in hindsight, there were some things that were wrong or some some things that she was like allowing to go on that maybe she shouldn't have. But generally he shows up to the kids' activities, he's supportive of them, especially their younger son. All of that creates like a complicated relationship on how the children feel about finding out their dad's a serial killer and being separated from him, which gets explored in this novel in a way that I don't entirely love. We wrap up at the end with like a very exciting, impactful ending. Like, I think the ending is very satisfying, it's unique, it's good, but getting there took us too long, was way too waffly and like meandering. If I were rating it on its own, it would probably be generic but fine, but because it's part of a series, it ends up just not living up to the first one. Next is going to be Lovely, Dark, and Deep by Megan Stockton. This is a short horror novel. Maybe it's a novella. It's about 186 pages. It is about an island that's evacuating because there's an incoming storm, and the local police can't leave the island because there's a missing baby and some other shenanigans going on, getting in their way of being able to leave. So now they and a few other key people are trapped on the island in a storm they should have left for, and there's possibly something else there with them. I think this is a fun horror beach slasher style story. I think it's great for the summer and your beach vacation. I think it might be taking place in fall, but because it's on the water, to me it's always giving summer beachy vibes. I would compare Megan Stockton stories to Anita Ailborn stories in a positive manner. I think Megan Stockton does a little bit better with characterization, making the characters likable, relatable, and people you want to root for, and people that like you would want to know in the real world. Where Ailborn stories, I think you root for those characters, but you're probably happy you don't meet them, and you're not that sad if they get killed. Like, I was legitimately concerned about some of these characters, even though we'd only had a couple of pages to get to know them, and I was also sorry when they died. I don't think she used like any cheap thrill or shock effects. I think her descriptions are good. I think the stalking and the killing is all tense and as gory as it needs to be, but not overkill there just for dramatic effect. What the ending will be is uncertain all the way up until you get there. So I'm gonna end up putting this one in I Had a Good Time. Next is Off the Deep End by Lucinda Berry. This is the second book by Lucinda Berry I've read this year. I compare her in my June reading wrap up to Jodi Picoult, and I stand by that. Is giving strong Her Sister's Keeper, or like that one book about the autistic boy who's accused of murder. For whatever reasons, I like Berry's writing style and I like Jodi Picoult's writing style. It's engaging, it's easy to read, it's something you want to pick up and keep going with, but thematically and plot-wise, there's problematic elements that leave a bad taste in my mouth. Spoilers, but they use a school shooting as part of like the escalating stakes of what's happening. And I do have an issue with how the school shooting is used as a prop. I really feel like it's there for melodrama shock, just not handled in a tactful, good way. So I think this one is going to end up in Don't Like. Next is going to be Princess by Claire Kent. This is the sequel to Haven. I didn't like it as much as the first one, but what's new? It seems like I never like a sequel as much as the first one. In this case, my issue is that I didn't feel the same level of connection in the romantic pair, and I really was kind of confused about why the girlie didn't think the dude liked her, and she was very convinced of it. Granted, he sent like one or two mixed signals, but it felt pretty self-evident they were mixed signals and why he'd be sending them, at least from my perspective. And you know, I have the benefit of this being a fictional novel, of not being personally invested, and knowing specifically that it's a romance. I think I'm going to put it up and I had a good time. It's not going to go up into read this now because I don't think it's quite at that caliber, but I did have a really good time with it and I do want to keep reading the series. I think it continues to develop the world and add new ideas into it that are interesting. I'm curious to see what else Claire Kent has come up with. There's a couple of other pairings on the horizon I'm really interested in. It's just that this one pairing wasn't the most compelling for me. Next is going to be Saved and its sequel Spare. I don't remember the author. I didn't like either of these books. I'm gonna put the first one in Don't Like and the second one in Not If You Were the Last Book on Earth. And I don't even know which one's first and which one's second, so don't 100% hold me to the ranking here. You might be asking, if I didn't like the first in the series, why did I continue on to the second? The premise of this book, betas were going to be paired off into alpha omega packs as like a protector of the omega. But I was like, oh good, we're going to follow a beta girl. Because this is a romance book, she's going to like fall in love with the alpha omega pack and integrate. And I'm here for a beta romance. Unfortunately, this girl isn't a beta, she's a secret omega. And this isn't a spoiler because it's revealed in like the first 3 chapters. It wasn't what I was pitched. I was pitched a beta romance. I kept reading even once I found this out because there were some indications between how she was responding and the alphas and their omega were responding that it was possible this was going to be like a switch omega verse. And what I mean by that is like maybe the omega could switch into being an alpha, the alphas could switch into being like omegas, and in her case she could switch between being like a beta and omega, because even though she's an omega, she doesn't have like all these overwhelming drives and she's able to hide it pretty easily. So I was like wondering if maybe she was like on the border. And because these dynamics were sort of hinting that, I was really hopeful because I find like that switching back and forth interesting, especially in a world where the dynamics are like really set into law. So then I rolled into the second book and became aware almost right away that was probably like 90% not what was going to happen. And I was like, well, I'll finish this up because it's a duology. Felt the world building was really weak and like we had over focused on like this government plot. A lot of these like alpha omega pack situations have more than enough going on within the pack. We don't need all this like outgoing large world things, and it ends up feeling very shallow, which is why the other one's like a never read again style category. Next is going to be Stillhouse Lake by Rachel Kane. I loved this one. There's a little bit of like overemphasis on like the internet trolls that like sort of translates nowadays to like hashtag getting canceled and hiding from the angry mob, and has like these right-leaning heavy-handed implications I don't like when you extend the metaphor out to a broader context. If you just hold it to like the context we're in right now about the mother and her children who are victims in this case, like the husband was a serial killer, none of them had any idea about it. They all fully cooperated with police. There was a trial for the wife and she was found innocent. And now the wife and the kids are in hiding because they're afraid of what this guy will send them from jail. They're afraid that all these like internet stalkers will come after them and kill them or harass them in real life. Does exist on the internet and doesn't belong, and in the case of these specific characters is entirely misplaced and inappropriate. It does stop us from moving forward as a society in a lot of ways, because what we should be asking is like, what would justice look like for the victims? What could we do to prevent something like this from happening again? What could we do to help these families recover? And instead of doing that, we're sitting here going after the wife and children of the serial killer who had no idea about any of this. Beyond all of that, like stuff to talk about, it is a tight, compact thriller. I really related to all the characters. They have unique, different voices. There's a couple of different things going on at the same time. It all wraps up very satisfyingly. And I think there's enough realism there for it to be like fun and engaging on that level too. So I'm gonna put this and read this now. I wouldn't move into the sequel after this, but book 1 is great. Next is gonna be The Alone Time by Elle Marr. This is a continuation of me discovering that sisters fiction is a subgenre of fiction and me looking for more in it. I loved the dynamic between these two sisters. I loved like their traumatic time in the woods. Fast forwarding 25 years later and them still dealing with it and handling it in adult ways that make me feel like we're not like exploiting children to make this story happen. I think it said some interesting things about society, documentaries, all this other kind of stuff all wrapped together. I think it leaves a certain level of uncertainty about exactly what happened while they were alone in the woods and leaves you unsure, and does like a decent level twisting things at the end. There are of course some problematic elements, problematic portrayals in it. In particular, they have a character who has DID, and I don't think it was fully understood what DID was, and the portrayal there was not great. Someone that most of the other characters were scared of. I just think the depiction as a whole was inaccurate and like contributes into harmful stereotypes we see in media. There's a weird cannibalism thing thrown in there that I don't 100% get. I think in the quest to make it unsure which of the sisters is the quote-unquote bad sister and whether or not there's a quote-unquote good sister in this mess, they had to do a lot of work to make the younger sister seem questionable and potentially dangerous. Added this this element, and then they tried to like close that loop and tie it all together. I don't think we necessarily needed to think the younger sister was the bad person. And I might even argue that they didn't successfully ever make me think that she was the bad one in this circumstance. I always saw her in the alone time as a little girl. Then she's a recovering drug addict. So like the whole span of this novel, she's just trying to recover memories, trying to do what's right. I never thought that we were going to turn around and find out she was the bad one who had done the bad things. Still, overall, I just think it's beautifully written. It's very engaging. It's emotional. It's a wonderful ride. I think I'm going to put it up in the read this now category. Next is going to be The Alpha of Bleak Island. This one was a surprise. I had no idea it was coming out, and I loved it when I picked it up and read it. It's very dragony. It's got a little bit of that alpha omega true mate kind of tropiness in it. I think the relationship, them coming to an understanding, developing that relationship, and like seeing them come together and become a pair is just really great, motivational, engaging stuff. It's not quite a read this now. I think it's going to be an easy, had a good time moment though. The Daughters of Block Island by Krista Carmen. I almost put it down in part one because that one's a little too long, uncertain, and melodramatic for me. But as soon as we roll into part two with the other sister who's a lot more action oriented, she's more supported and confident and doing things and hunting things down, everything picks up a little. The pacing improves dramatically. I wish part one hadn't gone on so long, but I'm glad I stuck with it because the ending is great. Part two is wonderful. Definitely a recommended read. Like all modern Gothic literature, it struggles finding its pacing and like length. Gonna put it in I had a good time. Next is The Devil and Mrs. Davenport by Paulette Kennedy. I love this. It's my new favorite read of the year. If you like Gothic fiction, if you like a 1950s housewife coming into her own, if you like books that explore feminine rage and good reasons historically for it to be a thing, this book 100% is for you. There's so many different elements and layers and aspects of imagery. I do have a longer Gothic review coming out for this one, so I'm not gonna belabor it too much, but this is an excellent book and you should definitely read it right now. Next is The Final Last Girl by Stephen Graham Jones. I've been dragging my feet on reading this and finishing up, and I finally DNF'd it. I got it, I just wasn't that interested, and I was never going to finish it at that rate. So I'm going to put it into generic but fine. I understand why your mileage varies. There's something very fun about a final last girl trope and making it real and basing something off of it. It lacked an extra oomph in execution that made me engaged, but I can see it as just a fun thing people want to read. Next is going to be The Seventh Bride by T. Kingfisher. I had a good time with this one. I don't have much to say. I was pleasantly surprised. This is the book I've picked up and put down a couple of times historically, and I'm glad I finally picked it up and gave it a fair chance. It has a lot of fun whimsy and fairy tale elements. I do think everything is just a little bit too easy and flows a little too well for our main character, but I mean that's part of what made the story fun and lighthearted. Next is The Stone Wolf's Rejected Mate by Kate C. Wells. This is a novella from the 5-pack series. I think I'm gonna end up by putting it in generic but fine. I liked it. I had a good time with it, but I'm looking at the other books that are up on the I had a good time list and it was nowhere near that. Next is gonna be The Waltham Murders, and this is not If You Were the Last Book on Earth. It started out really strong. I was really interested in it, but it got to be too many names and places, and I felt like I needed a corkboard and a conspiracy hat, and it was too hard for me to remember all of the different moving parts. And what started to be an engaging, broad examination of this one event started to feel just too broad, too much going on, and I really wish it had been more narratively driven. Even if I hadn't gotten the quote-unquote full context, I would have rathered a more strong thorough line through everything. And last is going to be These Toxic Things by Rachel Howell Hall. I had a good time with this. I just talked about this in the June reading wrap-up, so I am kind of talked out on it, but it is a great mystery thriller. I think the characters are fully rounded, developed, strong personalities. There's two mysteries that are interwoven in the story, and one of the mysteries, in my opinion, was much stronger than the other and much more interesting and engaging. The other one is a more personal mystery, and from my perspective, it was a lot of who even cares? Obviously, our protagonist cares. And they care deeply and are quite upset and have a whole coming apart about it. But the other one was just so much better. And I liked our character because she is nosy and curious, which on one side makes her good at her job, and on the other side it leads her right into the danger. It was a fun read. This is another one where the audio is available in Kindle Unlimited or maybe Amazon Prime. I can't quite discern what the difference is between the two of them. That means I got to listen for it, had already prepaid, and I think it's perfect if you're like on a drive or doing chores or anything like that. Okay, so I'm gonna look at these rankings and see if they're accurate. I think Devil Mrs. Davenport has to go first, then Dowry of Blood, then Haven, then The Alone Time. I think the writing on The Alone Time and the overall premise is just stronger. I do think Stillhouse Lake probably has wider appeal than The Alone Time does. It doesn't go as dark or grim. It's not quite as complex a narrative, but I just think The Alone Time is doing so many things so well that it is worth that risk for readers. I had a good time. I think Alpha of Bleak Island goes second, and Daughters of Block Island goes third. Princess is good. Forgotten Sisters definitely belongs first. I just really like it. It's very close to me telling you to read this now. I just think that ending is not going to be for everyone, and I do think it's just a little too long and meandering for most people. But Alpha of Bleak Island was just such a delightful surprise. It's got to go second. Daughters of Block Island was close to second, so here in third feels appropriate. Between Forgotten Sisters and Daughters of Block Island, Daughters of Block Island is actually the more approachable of these two modern Gothic stories. So if you want a modern goth, I might actually go Daughters of Block Island. But if you're looking for like poetic interweaving of many things in a way that like is fully satisfying, I might go Forgotten Sisters. If you see her as a respectable modern goth, it's fine. It's a little bit better than Lovely, Dark, and Deep just because I think there's more thematic things you could talk about in it. These Toxic Things doesn't have the supernatural or the goth element in it, although it's still a great solid thriller and have a little bit of a sci-fi piece to it. Because it's lacking that extra speculative element, and I'm a speculative reader, it's just a little bit lower on the list. Then Princess, like I said, I love this world, I love this series. This relationship just wasn't it for me. And then The Seventh Bride, because it borders on being just fine, but I think I had enough fun and I'm excited enough about more T. Kingfisher in my life that it can go here. Generic but fine. Follow the House of Usher is going to stay in the same place. I'm going to move the Stonewolf's Rejected Mate up one. Honestly, Final Last Girls is teetering into didn't like. And I think the didn't live up to series quality is appropriate. I didn't super enjoy reading either of these books. I'm going to keep reading Elisa Lynn Valdez's series, and I'm not going to keep reading the Rachel Kane series. I think that speaks for itself. I completely flipped. The don't like. Saved is the one I liked the least, with me being a little ambivalent to Off the Deep End. And then Minka Kent's After Dark, I didn't really give 100% of a fair shake to. It's just not for me. And who even really cares about Not If You're the Last Book on Earth? I think it's fine as is. So that's going to be everything ranked that I read in the past second quarter. But talk to me. Have you read any of these books? Do you agree with their ranking? Tell me in those comments down below. And as always, keep reading.